California's push to regulate artificial intelligence could reshape national markets and sideline smaller developers, but critics say no single state should dictate the future of AI policy and that Congress must act now to establish clear standards that protect innovation and prevent a patchwork of conflicting mandates. Joining Federal Drive host Terry Gerton earlier to explain why that matters is Professor Kevin Frazier, AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the University of Texas School of Law.
You wrote recently in Governing magazine about the tension between federal and state AI regulation and law regimes. You know, it wasn't that long ago that Congress debated a 10-year moratorium on state AI laws. Just refresh our memory. What happened with that?
Yeah, so there was a push in Congress to include that 10-year moratorium in the One Big Beautiful Bill, which for folks who have forgotten about the actual legislative mechanics of that bill, it was a reconciliation bill, which imposes some weird limitations on Congress and how it structures various provisions that get included in that bill. And so this moratorium, for lack of a better phrase, was a poorly crafted vehicle for achieving some of the underlying aims that actually drove some folks in Congress to support this moratorium. In other words, it was a very blunt instrument. There wasn't a whole lot of tailoring going on, according to who you ask. The language was very ambiguous. It wasn't clear how it would be implemented. And so rightfully, this all kind of fell apart because when folks realized that governing AI is one of the most consequential decisions we're facing right now. It's a matter of incredible economic importance, of national security significance, and getting this right, or minimally not getting this wrong, is really important. And so when Congress saw this kind of rough package come before them, they said, you know what, maybe we should continue to think about this a little bit further. Well, now I would just say we've had a couple more months of consideration, a couple more months of AI development, and now Congress is in a space based off of just a few weeks ago, 5 congressional hearings all about AI, to think a little bit more methodically about how best to draw the line between federal authority and state authority in this context.
Well, and also subsequent to the negotiations over the summer, the president has released his AI strategy plan. So how does that sort of guide the conversation about who rules, whether the federal government rules or state rules?
Yeah, so the AI action plan, to your point, Terry, very much helped confirm that a federal forward approach would be the policy preference of the president, at least with respect to what I'll call AI development. Now, just to break things down for a brief second, there's AI development, which is the process of actually training and deploying some of these most sophisticated models. So think about the billion-dollar process of training ChatGPT-5 or Claude or Gemini. This is a highly sophisticated and highly complex endeavor that the labs take on every about 3 to 6 months. Then there's AI use. This is who should use AI, for what context, and with what safeguards. So, for example, do we want to limit how doctors use AI in certain contexts, or do we want to increase the barriers to teachers using AI in elementary school, so on and so forth? So if we think about these two different domains, AI development and AI use, really what I'd say is the emerging consensus is that AI development, which is really shaping our frontier of AI, is something that's very much a national priority and a matter of national consequence. And so this sounds like the sort of regulatory task that if we go all the way back to the founding, we would have seen slotted into that category of this sounds like the sort of thing that Congress should lead on. But with respect to AI use, how we see AI show up in schools, how we see it show up in the doctor's office, that sounds exactly like the sort of thing the founders would have said, hey, let's slot that and leave that for the states under the 10th Amendment.
Well, while Congress is getting its act together on this and having hearings, states are moving out. And you flagged that California has nearly 50 AI-related bills up for consideration. What do they cover and what's going on there?
This is a highly volatile time in the race to regulate AI, with states, specifically California, moving pretty quickly ahead. So quickly that by the time we have this conversation run, we may see that the 16 specific AI bills pending before Gavin Newsom right now in California may or may not have been signed. And among those 16 bills, some of them are exactly as I've categorized. They're addressing the specific use of AI in certain contexts, like do we want AI used for elections, or how are we going to limit deep fakes, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we see some of these bills which may bleed into that category of interfering with AI development, or perhaps trying to alter how AI labs actually train these models. And the issue with that is, as Representative Ted Lieu from California raised during a recent congressional hearing, if one state says you have to train a model pursuant to standard A, and another state says you have to train it pursuant to standard B, that automatically becomes an impossible task for the labs. They're not able to do 50 different training runs pursuant to 50 different standards. And so we're going to be left with the question of, is Congress going to step into this void and clarify that while it may be appropriate for states to regulate within their borders and regulate certain AI use cases, AI development, the real crux of AI innovation, is the domain that Congress should be seizing?
I'm speaking with Professor Kevin Frazier. He is the AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the University of Texas School of Law. We just wound up there on a really important point, which is if you've got 50 different states making 50 different sets of regulations, and most of these AI firms are global, so they're also responding to EU regulation and other international regulation, where did they wind up? In a case of uncertainty, what is the least risky path for them?
So the least risky path, Terry, is to comply with the harshest standard. And this is why we have what's known as the California effect, where we've seen California lead on imposing some pretty stringent regulations, for example, around vehicle emissions. Rather than build one car for California and build one car for the rest of the country, we see that California's standards have become the law of the land. It's also why we have, to your point earlier, the Brussels effect. Often we see that the EU imposes the strictest standards, and companies, rather than trying to segment their products out, will govern pursuant to the EU standard. Now, in many ways, some folks may be thinking, oh, that sounds fine. If I agree with that regulation, then great. We have this policy get set up and Congress doesn't even have to do anything. But I think it's important to remember that some of the regulations being considered right now in California, for example, AB 1064, which deals with AI companions and their use by children, include provisions such as mandating that labs ensure that factual accuracy of the AI's responses is prioritized over perhaps the values or preferences of the user. And while we all may say, factual accuracy, great, we're going to make sure our kids get accurate facts. Well, who determines what the accurate fact is? Is it California that it's deciding? Is it Texas? Is it Florida? So on and so forth. And so some of these provisions, which are very well intentioned, really put us at risk of a world in which certain states are exercising their kind of economic might in a way that may bleed into other jurisdictions.
You also talk about that kind of regulatory compliance, sort of the narrowing of the regulatory window, as creating a barrier to entry for smaller firms. A lot of innovation in the AI space starts with startups. And so how does that failure to regulate, in this case, create a barrier to entry for innovative new startups?
Yeah, so I think, Terry, one of the most important areas where we're seeing ambiguity chill innovation right now is around fair use and copyright. So copyrighted data has been included in a lot of the training data that companies rely on to train their models. And the courts are uncertain of whether or not that qualifies as a fair use exception for training on copyrighted materials. So labs, particularly small labs, that don't know the law of the land, when they go to a venture capitalist and try to say, hey, I want to raise another round, I want you to bet on my company, the venture capitalists are saying, hey, look, we've seen two different courts reach two different decisions in the same federal district. I'm not sure we should gamble on this, right? This is too sketchy. And so in that case, regulatory uncertainty is a big issue. But it's also important to point out that while many legislators are attuned to the need to support innovation, creating thresholds around size, for example, saying that this bill will not pertain to companies that make less than this amount in revenue. Well, Terry, what's the point of every startup? You want to grow as quickly as possible. You want to become the big guy. I've yet to meet a founder that says, okay, as soon as we make $499,000 in revenue per year, we're quitting. That's the end of the ball game. I have no more ambition. That entrepreneurial drive is gone. So we need to pay attention to the downstream and long-term consequences of these bills, even if they do include carve-outs for startups.
All right, so let's assume that Congress comes back to work at some point in October. What do you recommend that they start on first with respect to AI statutory legislation?
I think the most important thing that Congress needs to do is emphasize and clarify that AI development is the exclusive domain of Congress. And so this would look like ensuring that there's preemption around state bills that attempt to change that AI training process, because as we'd covered, it's just not technically feasible for AI training to be done pursuant to 50 different states. And no state should get a first pass in saying that their rules, their norms, their standard should be the one that influences the training of models that will then be diffused across the country. So I think that's where Congress should start. And then I think they should make sure they're working with states to think through innovative ways to make sure that states can at once regulate AI use, but do so in a way that doesn't bleed over into other jurisdictions.
Kevin Frazier is the AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the University of Texas. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.